It was a humid afternoon at a bustling gas station on the outskirts of a small southern town. Officer James Walker, a well-known figure in the community for his calm demeanor and dedication to fairness, stopped by to grab a bottle of water and use the restroom. His uniform was neatly pressed, his badge gleaming in the sunlight, a symbol of his 15 years of service to the town. As James walked into the restroom, a group of 4 white men loitered near the entrance. Their loud laughter and rough jokes filled the air. They had been drinking, their beer cans scattered nearby, and their loud, overconfident tones made them the center of attention for anyone within earshot. Spotting James, they exchanged knowing looks, their expressions shifting from amusement to something more mischievous. "Look at this guy, all serious," one of them muttered, loud enough for James to hear as he disappeared into a stall. The others chuckled. James paid no mind. He had dealt with plenty of situations involving people who mistook his quiet strength for weakness. He entered a stall, latched the door, and focused on the task at hand, unwilling to engage with the group's antics. But the men had other plans. As James was about to exit the stall, the door wouldn't budge. Confused, he pushed harder, but it didn't move. Then he heard the unmistakable sound of laughter. Peering through the small crack, he saw 2 of the men pressing their weight against the door, blocking his exit. "Guess you're stuck now, officer," one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. The others roared with laughter, their voices bouncing off the tiled walls. James's heart pounded, not with fear, but with controlled frustration. His training had taught him to remain calm under pressure. He knew that in this moment, any reaction other than calmness could escalate the situation in dangerous ways. "All right, fun's over," James said, his voice steady. "Let me out." But his words only fueled their amusement. They banged on the stall door, making exaggerated comments about his predicament, their tones tinged with a false sense of superiority. They treated it like a joke, a harmless prank, but to James, it was a clear challenge to his dignity and authority. What the men didn't realize, however, was that James was far from powerless. Quietly, he reached for his radio, clipped to his belt, and pressed the emergency button. The signal would alert his nearby colleagues that he needed immediate assistance. James leaned against the stall wall, listening as the men continued their mockery, waiting for the inevitable arrival of justice. The laughter outside the stall grew louder, each jeering remark more obnoxious than the last. One of the men leaned against the stall door, tapping it with his fist in a steady rhythm, as though this was all part of some harmless game. "You stuck in there, officer? Need a hand?" he taunted, his voice filled with mock concern. The others burst into another round of laughter. Inside the cramped stall, Officer James Walker remained composed. He had learned long ago how to channel frustration into focus, how to measure his actions and words to avoid feeding situations like this. Still, his grip tightened around the small black radio clipped to his belt, its signal already dispatched to the nearest patrol units. He didn't respond to their taunts. Silence often spoke louder than words in moments like these, forcing the antagonists to confront their own behavior. But the men, emboldened by what they assumed was his helplessness, only pushed further. One of them jiggled the stall door, testing its sturdiness. "Bet you're regretting walking in here now, huh?" another called out, his tone laced with mockery. James heard footsteps outside the restroom, the sound faint but distinct. It was a relief, but he knew the situation needed careful handling. He couldn't afford for this to spiral into something worse. Not for himself, not for anyone else who might walk into this scene unprepared. The men, oblivious to the growing tension outside, continued their antics. They slapped each other on the back, their laughter echoing as though they were in a private club rather than a public restroom. One of them even pulled out a smartphone, aiming it at the stall as though capturing evidence of their so-called fun. "Smile, officer. This is going viral," he cackled. James's jaw clenched. The temptation to force his way out was strong, but he held back. He knew that the power of his response lay in timing and control, not in brute force. Instead, he took another deep breath and waited. Then the door to the restroom swung open with a loud creak. The noise immediately silenced the group's laughter. Heavy footsteps followed, a deliberate, commanding rhythm. James recognized those footsteps instantly. His backup had arrived. "What's going on in here?" a firm voice demanded. The group froze, their faces twisting into expressions of surprise and confusion. Two uniformed officers stood in the doorway, their presence unmistakable. The room seemed to shrink under their authoritative gaze. "Oh, nothing," one of the men stammered, his bravado evaporating. "We were just joking around." The lead officer's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the blocked stall and the men's guilty postures. He said nothing for a moment, letting the weight of the silence press down on them. Then he stepped forward. "Unlock the stall. Now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man leaning against the door hesitated, his face pale. Slowly, he stepped back, allowing James to finally push the door open. As he emerged, the air in the room shifted. His calm, unshaken presence seemed to tower over the group, their earlier confidence now replaced with nervous glances and shuffling feet. James straightened his uniform and met the eyes of the men one by one. His silence spoke volumes, his expression unreadable yet charged with meaning. The officers who had arrived didn't need to ask questions. The scene told them everything they needed to know. "You think this is funny?" the lead officer said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Harassing someone like this? Blocking their way? Let's see how funny it feels when you explain it down at the station." The men's protests began immediately, their words tumbling over each other in desperate attempts to justify their actions. But it was too late. James stood quietly to the side as his colleagues took control, issuing clear instructions and ensuring the group understood the gravity of their behavior. As the men were escorted out, James finally spoke, his voice steady and low. "You may have thought this was just a game," he said, meeting their eyes. "But actions have consequences. It's time you learned that." With that, James turned and walked out of the restroom, his composure unshaken. The sound of the men's subdued voices faded behind him, replaced by the distant hum of traffic outside. Justice had arrived, not with anger or force, but with quiet resolve and unwavering integrity. Outside the gas station, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights of the patrol cars and the commotion inside. The four men, now visibly subdued, stood awkwardly as the officers completed their questioning. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by uneasy glances and mumbled excuses. Officer James Walker stepped out of the restroom, his calm demeanor unbroken. He adjusted his badge, its polished surface catching the sunlight, and approached the scene. The lead officer in charge of the response, Sergeant Lewis, turned to James with a nod, silently acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "Officer Walker, are you all right?" Lewis asked. "I'm fine," James replied, his tone steady, "but I'd like to address them before this goes any further." Lewis hesitated, then stepped aside. The four men looked up, their faces a mixture of apprehension and embarrassment. They shifted uncomfortably as James approached, his measured footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. "You might not understand it now," James began, his voice calm but firm. "But what you did today wasn't just a prank. It wasn't harmless fun. You chose to single someone out, to put them in a situation where you felt you had control, where you could laugh at their expense." One of the men opened his mouth as if to protest, but James raised a hand, silencing him. "I've spent my life serving this community," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the group. "Not because I expect gratitude or respect, but because I believe in doing what's right. I believe in protecting people, even those who don't understand the harm they cause. Today you crossed a line, not just with me, but with what it means to treat others with decency." The men shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado now replaced with visible shame. James let the weight of his words settle before stepping back. Sergeant Lewis cleared his throat, stepping forward to address the men. "You're being charged with disorderly conduct and harassment," Lewis said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're also recommending mandatory community service and educational courses. You'll have plenty of time to think about your actions and their consequences." As the men were led to the waiting patrol cars, one of them, a younger man with a nervous expression, paused and turned back toward James. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said hesitantly. "I'm sorry." James studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "It's not about what you meant," he said. "It's about what you did. Make sure this is the last time you make someone feel small to make yourself feel big." The young man nodded, his face pale, and turned back toward the patrol car. As the scene quieted, the crowd began to disperse. Some onlookers approached James, offering words of support and gratitude for his composure. He accepted their kindness with a quiet nod, but didn't linger. For him, the work was never about recognition. It was about making a difference, even in moments like this. James walked to his patrol car, his mind already shifting to the tasks ahead. But as he sat behind the wheel, he took a moment to reflect. Today had been another reminder of why he wore the badge. Not just to enforce the law, but to set an example, to show that dignity and integrity could triumph over thoughtlessness and harm. As he drove away, the fading sound of the sirens felt less like a mark of chaos and more like a call for change, a reminder that every action, no matter how small, carried weight. Later that evening, Officer James Walker sat in his modest living room, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The warm glow of a lamp cast long shadows on the walls, but his thoughts were focused, his expression calm yet contemplative. His years of experience had taught him that moments like these often carried lessons, not just for others, but for himself as well. The phone on the table buzzed softly, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Sergeant Lewis. "James," Lewis said on the other end, his tone lighter now that the day's chaos had settled. "Just wanted to let you know, the guys are in custody, the charges are processed, and the judge's office has approved the community service recommendation. They'll also be attending mandatory behavioral education courses." James leaned back in his chair, nodding to himself. "That's good," he said. "They need to understand the impact of their actions." There was a pause on the line before Lewis spoke again. "You handled yourself well today, better than most would have. Not everyone has your level of patience." "It's not about patience," James replied. "It's about making sure the outcome leads to something more than just punishment. If they walk away angry or unchanged, then nothing improves. But if this experience makes them think, really think about their choices, then maybe it's worth it." After hanging up, James allowed himself a moment of quiet. his thoughts drifted to the young man who had apologized outside the gas station. There had been sincerity in his voice, a flicker of understanding. James hoped that small spark would grow into something meaningful, a change in perspective that might ripple outward. The next morning, James returned to his usual routine, starting the day with a jog through his neighborhood. As he ran past familiar streets and faces, he was reminded of why he served. Every person he greeted, every wave he exchanged, reaffirmed his belief that community was built not just through laws, but through mutual respect and accountability. Later that week, he received an unexpected call. It was the young man from the gas station incident. He had reached out through the local precinct, asking to speak with James directly. Though surprised, James agreed to meet him at a small diner in town. When they met, the young man was visibly nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry for what happened," he began. "It wasn't right, and I've been thinking a lot about it since that day." James listened quietly, giving the man space to speak. "I guess I never really thought about how my actions could hurt someone else," the man continued. "I was just following along with the group, trying to fit in, but that's no excuse. I want to do better." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Acknowledging the harm is the first step," he said, "but the real change comes from what you do next. It's not about feeling guilty, it's about using that guilt to guide better choices." Their conversation lasted over an hour. By the end of it, the young man seemed lighter, as though unburdened by the weight of his mistakes. James left the diner with a sense of quiet hope, reminded that even small moments of understanding could create ripples of positive change. In the weeks that followed, the story of the incident spread through the town, but instead of being remembered for the confrontation, it became a symbol of accountability and growth. The men involved completed their community service, and local leaders used the incident as an opportunity to start conversations about respect and empathy. For James, the experience was a reminder of why he had chosen this path. His badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a tool for building bridges, for fostering understanding, even in the most difficult situations. And as he went about his duties, he carried with him the quiet certainty that change, though slow and often challenging, was always possible when approached with integrity and resolve.